Hello, this is Dr. Martell, and this lecture will be on Plotinus and Neoplatonism. And I want to begin by saying a few things about this word, Neoplatonism, because I think it's actually a controversial term as applied to Plotinus. I suspect that Plotinus would have resisted being classified as a Neoplatonist. My suspicion is that he would have insisted that he was just a Platonist. He was just a follower of Plato. This term was coined by and popularized by historians of philosophy of the 19th century, most of whom, to begin with, I suspect, were Germans. And they coined this term in an effort to avoid what they regarded as a misunderstanding. The misunderstanding, according to them, amounted to this. Thinking that Plotinus's philosophy and Plato's philosophy are the same. Okay, that, in the view of these historians, was a misunderstanding. Okay, to avoid this misunderstanding, they would insist on calling Plotinus and his followers new Platonists. That's what Neoplatonist means, like new Platonists, as opposed to, of course, like the old Platonists, who would have included Plato himself. Now, if anybody was a real Platonist, it was, of course, Plato himself. And so it does seem to me that in calling Plotinus and his followers new Platonists, it is implied that these people are not like the genuine article, right? It's at the very least strongly suggested that what they are doing departs significantly, right, from what Plato was doing. What they held, what they believed, departs significantly from Plato's views. Based upon what I know about Plotinus, again, my suspicion is that he would claim otherwise. He would instead claim to be someone who was simply saying again what Plato had already said, and where Plato had merely thought something and not actually written it down, right? He was merely saying, right, what Plato really thought, but had not actually committed to writing. Another way of putting this is that I think Plotinus would resist being called a Neoplatonist because he would have regarded himself as like the genuine article, like a real Platonist, someone who is true to Plato. We don't actually know very much about Plotinus. We do know when he was born. He was born in 205, so this is a 3rd century Common Era figure, or 3rd century AD. He was born in Egypt. We don't know where, but we do know that he eventually settled in Alexandria. And that's important because Alexandria was at this time the chief center of learning and teaching, research in the part of the world, the ancient world, dominated by the Romans. So we know that Plotinus would have received the very best philosophical education available, and so he would have then been actually quite well versed in the views of all the major ancient schools of philosophy among the Greeks and the Romans. When he completed his studies, he volunteered to join an expedition that the Roman emperor had planned against people living to the east. And so these were people, whatever their kingdoms were called. These were people who were living in Persia, right? And so this is yet another war against Persians, essentially. It did not go well. Okay. More on that in a moment. Plotinus, he joined this expedition, not in the hopes of, like winning fame as a warrior or anything like that. Instead, he joined in the hopes of meeting wise people, sages, in Persia. These are people about whom stories were circulating within the Roman Empire. Plotinus wanted to meet them, talk with them about how to do well as a human being, right? Maybe argue with them about this, and thereby come to have a better understanding of basically how to conduct life well. Okay, and that didn't happen, and again, it didn't happen because this expedition was a total disaster. I think like almost immediately, the emperor himself was captured by the enemy. If memory serves, he was enslaved by them for a time, made to do a host of like humiliating things, and then he was executed. Plotinus escaped the worst of it, and he then settled in Rome. and in Rome, he started to teach. Near as I can tell, he taught primarily by just lecturing on Plato. So he presented himself to students as just someone who was an expositor, just an explainer of Plato's philosophy. And that's actually why, again, I think he would resist this appellation. He would resist being called a Neoplatonist, a new Platonist, as opposed to the old Platonist, including Plato himself. He was a very successful teacher, attracted many students, and around about the time he was 50, in order to aid his students, he began creating lecture notes that could circulate like among them, right? So lecture notes for his like best students, essentially, to read. He did not, to the best of my knowledge, write anything with the intention during his lifetime of having it read by the general public, right? So this was basically just for students. After he died, his best student, I think, Porphyry, compiled these notes and organized them and edited them in other respects. And that resulting work is called the Aeneid, and that's what has come down to us. That's what survived of Plotinus' writing. That's how we know most of what we think we know about his views. So I'm going to go ahead and try and explain what I can of Plotinus' views by starting with his ethical views and then turning to his metaphysical views. And as you'll see, both his ethical views and his metaphysical views are, as you would expect, heavily informed by Plato's philosophy, by his reading of Plato's philosophy. Indeed, as I'll argue in just a moment, his ethical views, they manifest actually I would call it like a profound, like a deep reading, a very sophisticated reading of Plato's Republic. Okay, as you'll see, his metaphysical views draw heavily upon the allegory of the cave, which is a part of Plato's Republic, as well as the Timaeus. Right, so let me start with his ethics. So the Republic seems to be the main text that Plotinus draws his own ethical philosophy from. Okay? Plato's Republic is initially primarily about the form of justice. Right? So the very first philosophical question that gets raised in the text is what is justice? There's a series of attempts to define it. Initially, none of them succeed, and then a sophist character, as you might expect, raises a different related question, and the question is whether it's better to be a just person than an unjust person. The sophist in the book, of course, argues that it's better to be an unjust person. This is what you would expect, having read, Critias and Antiphon. The character Socrates then proceeds to argue that it's better to be a just person. In order to make this argument, he has to, though, he claims, first get clear on what it is to be a just individual. Right? The idea is that once we see what it is to be a just individual, we'll be able to see why it's better to be that kind of person than an unjust person. But he thinks that he's going to have an easier time figuring out what a just person is like if he can first figure out what a just society is like. Right? Because he thinks that once we see what a just society is like, we'll have kind of a clue to figuring out what a just individual is like. Because surely like the two must be similar. Otherwise, we wouldn't use the same word to talk about both. Okay? So we want to prove that it's better to be a just person than an unjust person. Right? To do that, we're going to identify like what justice in the individual is. But to do that, we're going to first figure out what justice in society is. Well, in order to figure out what justice in society is, Socrates first tries to figure out what the best society is. Period. Assuming that whatever other features the best society has, it's surely going to be a just society. Otherwise, we wouldn't call it the best society, right? So if we're going to find justice in society anywhere, we're going to find it in the best of all societies. And so there's an effort to figure out like what the best society is. Famously, Socrates develops a view according to which the best society is a society that has three basic parts. So there's one part to which the vast majority of people belong, and that's the part devoted to doing things like smithing, so creating various like metal tools, shipbuilding, tailoring, farming, retail trade. That's most people, right? There's another part of the society that's devoted to using violence against enemies of the society, enemies both external and internal. So this is a class of soldiers or warriors. Right? They're called auxiliaries in the Republic. And then perhaps most famously of all, there's yet another group of people, another class, comparatively small number of people. Right? So compared to like the class of the warriors and the class of the craftspeople. This is the ruling class. And people belonging to this class are called guardians. And it is then argued that this society, being the best society, surely has like all of the main virtues. It surely has wisdom and courage and moderation and justice too. And justice, it is argued, in this society amounts to each of those parts doing its job, right? Like the thing that it's suited for, while not interfering with the other parts, the other classes, as they do what they're suited for, right? Okay, if that's what justice in society is, right, we should expect justice in the individual to be something similar. It should be a relationship between three parts of the person, in particular three parts of the soul, the psyche, psyche in Greek, such that each part does its job without interfering, right, in the job that is best performed, that is suited to some other part. Okay? The three parts of the psyche, according to Socrates, are as follows. There's desire, right? This is the aspect of the psyche that moves you to meet your needs, and also to like get what you want, right? There is, in addition to desire, reason, right? Reason's job is to decide what to do, right? Given the desires that you have and the circumstances in which you find yourself, okay, on the basis of evidence, right? So reason understands, and in light of understanding, it decides, okay? There's a third part of the soul, according to Socrates. In Greek, this part of the soul is called thumos, that's Thumos. It's sometimes translated as spirit, and other times, rather confusingly, I think, translated as will. its job is to help reason, which is the properly ruling part of the psyche, exercise control over, dominion over desire, right? So reason in this scheme corresponds to the guardians in society. Thumos, spirit or will, corresponds to the soldiers, also called auxiliaries, right, in society. And desire, or sometimes called appetite in some translations, that corresponds to that biggest class of craftspeople or business people, they're sometimes called, in the ideal society. Okay, so that's apparently what justice is, according to Socrates, and thus apparently what justice is in the individual, according to Plato, right? Assuming that Socrates is here speaking for Plato. That is how things look on a superficial reading, I think, of Republic. Actually, things are more complicated than that, and I believe that Plotinus he picked up on this, like he was aware of this, right? And it's crucial for the philosophical ethics that he develops. Right? What Plotinus, I suspect, picked up on is the following. That ideal society that's so famous, the one that's ruled by guardians, right, and then has this other class of soldiers and this biggest class of basically everyone else. That society is not, strictly speaking, the best society, according to the character Socrates in Republic. Instead, it's the best that you can do where society is concerned, if the bulk of your population consists of people who desire more than they need, right? Another way of saying people desire more than they need is to say that they desire luxuries, right? That famous ideal society, that's the best society. That's the best we can do where society is concerned. When we're dealing with a population consisting of mostly people who desire luxuries, right? That's not, right, strictly speaking, the best society, according to Socrates in Republic. When the character of Socrates in Republic first begins to develop an ideal society, when he first begins to lay out what that is in an effort to figure out what justice in society is, the society that he initially constructs, sort of in speech, is very small. It consists of 9 people, and each of them have different jobs to do. Right? So there's division of labor, but interestingly, there are no soldiers, and there are no rulers either. Right? So you don't have any one person or even small group of people telling other people what to do, and then another small group basically using force, right? Like using the threat of violence or violence, right, to get those orders executed, right? There are no soldiers in this first ideal society, and there are no rulers either. Okay. This is also, and I think this is the key distinguishing feature of this society. This is probably the feature in virtue of which neither soldiers nor rulers are needed. This is also a society in which people are only motivated to obtain what they need and not more than that. Right, so these people only desire necessities. They have no desire for luxuries. Socrates, actually, the character Socrates, he maintains that's best, and he only consents to change, right, what he has said about the best society, when another character in the dialogue named Glaucon objects and says that the life that Socrates here is creating for these people, because it only involves necessities. Glaucon argues that that's not a life fit for human beings to live, right? A life that is fit for human beings to live, that's a life that involves luxuries. And so he insists that Socrates basically change things, right? And instead of assuming that people are only moved to get what they need, right? Assume instead that people are motivated to get more, they pursue more, and they very often also acquire more. Okay? Socrates agrees to this, but not because, and he's explicit about this, not because he agrees with this other character Glaucon, right? He never says, "Oh, I agree with you," right? A life appropriate to human beings has to have luxuries. No, he never agrees to that. He in fact, I believe, insists that the society he constructed first, that's really best. Okay, instead of agreeing with this other character Glaucon that no, we've got to have luxuries, right? He just more or less humors him by saying, okay, let's grant your assumption that a life appropriate to human beings has to have luxuries. Let's now see, on the basis of that assumption, how well things can go. Let's construct a best society, given that these are the kinds of people that we have to work with. Okay, the result is that ideal society that has guardians and auxiliaries and this other big class of craftspeople or business people. Tellingly, as Socrates begins to construct this second best society in his view, second best is not really best. He calls it, at least in English translation, a feverish society. In other words, it's a sick society. It's society in an unhealthy state, right? So that famous ideal society, supposedly Plato's ideal society, right? That's actually, according to character Socrates in the book itself, I guess the best sick society possible. It is not a healthy society. Okay. What am I driving at here? Well, I'm driving at the following. Socrates' account, his initial account of justice in the individual, it's modeled on justice in society. But his account of justice in society is an account of justice in a society that is feverish, that's not in the condition that it should be in. Okay, what this suggests is that justice in the individual, as he initially describes it, is perhaps a kind of justice in the individual, but not truly the best kind of justice in the individual. Right? What it suggests is that this famous account of justice in the individual is justice in an individual who is psychologically less than ideal. It's justice in an individual who wants too much, right? Who doesn't just want what she or he needs, but wants much, much more than that. Okay, this kind of a person, they need to have their desires controlled, right? Dominion has to be exercised over them. One part of their psyche has to be able to force the other part of their psyche to comply. Something like repression is needed, and that's what justice in this kind of a person amounts to. But look, just as not every society, according to Socrates, is a society consisting of people who want more than they need, right? So perhaps not every individual human being is a person who desires more than they need. Okay? if there were someone who wasn't such that they desired more than they need, right? Justice in them might well look different, might well be something different, right, than justice in, shall we say, like a psychologically flawed individual. Psychologically flawed insofar as they desire more than they need. What I'm getting at is that there might be unstated another view of what justice in the individual is than the view that Plato, by way of the character Socrates, explicitly gives voice to in Republic, right? And this is if not confirmed, at least strongly suggested by what Plato, again by way of the character Socrates, goes on to say about philosophers. So as Republic proceeds, we eventually learn that the guardians, the rulers of the ideal society, ideally they should be philosophers. So there ought to be like philosopher rulers. This raises the question of who a philosopher is. And in order to answer that question, Socrates tells us about how philosophers are educated. So the philosopher is going to be the person, right, who goes through a particular educational process. And the educational process is one that he explains by way of that allegory, the allegory of the cave. That's an allegory for the educative process that results in being a philosopher. Okay. We know, familiar with that story as we are, that in the allegory, the educational process, like strictly speaking, like ends when the prisoner escapes the cave and is then able to see reflections in a still pool of water of rocks and grass and trees, and is also able to like look up into the sky and see the planets and stars, all of which would have been understood to be like heavenly bodies, right? And like most importantly, the sun. When the prisoner sees all of this, the prisoner finally understands what it was that he had been looking at all that time in the cave, on the back of the cave wall, right? Shadows. Stuff that isn't independently real, but instead, right, depends upon other stuff that is more real than it is. Okay. Look, it's fairly clear from that story that the place to be is outside the cave. Okay. So that story not only tells us who the philosopher is by explaining how they are educated, it also conveys this idea that the best way to live is the philosophical life. Okay? The person living the philosophical life, they understand something that other people don't understand. They understand that the objects that most people take to be fundamentally real are in fact barely real at all. Right? Their reality is ephemeral. It's comparable to the reality of shadows, right? It's fleeting, ever-changing, and dependent. Okay. Look, that's the way to be. That's the way to live like a philosopher. And the philosopher is someone who understands this. Okay. It follows that the philosopher is someone who is going to be rather contemptuous of shadows. Shadows, of course, stand for, in the allegory, the things that most people take to be fundamentally real, like physical objects, stuff that's given to the senses. bodies, material things, right? Okay. The philosopher is going to live in a way that basically demonstrates a kind of contempt for these things. They are not important. And so the philosopher is only going to deal with them to the extent that is just absolutely necessary for doing the other things that philosophers are wont to do. Okay, and what do philosophers want? What are they about? Right? What do they do if they're right not always concerning themselves with shadow-like physical things? Well, I mean, they're in the allegory, like they're gazing at the heavenly bodies, right? Stars, planets, moon, but like most importantly, the sun. Okay. What this tells us is that the best way of life is the way of life of a person who rates physical things given to the senses, like very low. This is someone who is only interested in these things to the extent that's necessary in order to do like the really important things. More on what those things are in a moment. Okay. So this is then someone who is really not moved one way or the other very much by physical things, by material things. Another way of putting this point, this is someone in whom desire, right, like that part of the psyche that moves us, right, toward or away from various bodies, depending upon whether they please us, right, or bring us suffering. Like this part of the psyche in the person who is living the best life for a human being, this part of the psyche is very, very weak. It's very weak. Right? It's as though in the person living the best kind of life, the philosophical life, desire has atrophied. Okay? Indeed, it's so weak that it doesn't need a ruler. It doesn't need to be forcefully controlled. Right? It is only strong enough to motivate this person leading the philosophical life to get what they need. Nothing beyond that. Okay, so that they can devote what remains of their energies to doing like the really important things. Okay, like what are the really important things? Well, go back to the allegory of the cave. If you're not concerned with shadows, what are you concerned with? Right? Heavenly bodies, planets, stars, moon, and the sun. What do those stand for in the allegory? It's fairly clear that they stand for forms. Okay, and the sun in particular, Plato says when through the character Socrates when explaining the allegory. That's the good, and it's that on which ultimately everything else depends in order to be. This is one of the things that the prisoner, upon like escaping the cave and eventually seeing the sun, realizes. The sun is special among all the other things, insofar as it is that upon which absolutely everything else depends in order to exist. And it also seems as though it's that upon which everything else depends in order to be known. After all, it's the ultimate source of all the light that there is, right? And we have to have light in order to see. Okay, so right, the person living the philosophical life, this is someone who turns away from the senses, turns away from the objects of the senses, material things, bodies. This is someone who has contempt for those things. Desire in them atrophies. And they instead are all about being in touch with, being in tune with, right, that which is more real. Right? What's more real? The forms. And so the person leading the philosophical life, which is the best life for a human being, that's someone who has contempt for bodily things and prioritizes knowing forms. And if the sun represents something that isn't a form, somehow like being in tune with it too, right? So that's basically, I think, Plotinus's philosophical ethics, right? It's an ethics which is quite, I think, ascetic is the right word, right? Because it involves adopting an attitude of contempt for like objects of desire, right? Physical things which can please us or bring us suffering, right? The appropriate attitude is one of a kind of disregard for these things, treating them as unimportant, and instead focusing in one way or another on that which is not given to the senses, that which is in no way physical or bodily. Forms, right? And if what the sun represents is something like other than forms, something other than forms too. Okay, so that then brings me to Plotinus's metaphysics. So in the allegory of the cave, Socrates actually says that the sun represents the good. It's the good. Okay. And the other participants in the dialogue ask Socrates to explain, like, well, what the good is, and they offer various suggestions. Like one character says, "Oh, Socrates, is it pleasure?" And Socrates says, "Well, no, it's not that." And then they ask, "Well, what is it, Socrates?" And he says, "I can't say. I can't say." Okay. I think that part of the dialogue, Plotinus really fixates on. It's difficult to say what it is the sun represents in the allegory of the cave. Plato called it the good, right? Plotinus is going to use a different word for it. He calls it the one. It's the one, okay? Like what is like the one? We're actually already very familiar with this notion. It's not that much of a stretch to say it's the god of Xenophanes, or it's like the one of Parmenides, right? It has some similarities with Aristotle's unmoved mover, too. So it's something that neither comes into existence nor goes out of existence. Like the Greek gods, it's deathless, it's immortal, and also like anything divine, according to the Greeks, it's completely self-sufficient, right? It's like all good all the time. Like Parmenides, one, it doesn't have any parts. It's like perfectly uniform, perfectly homogeneous, and it's numerically one too. It is not multiple, it is not plural. One could put it this way: it's one and all. Okay. We can't say much more about it though than that, because saying much more about it would, in one way or another, commit us to like differentiating it from other things, like setting it apart from other things, right? Almost any attempt to say anything more is going to involve that kind of a move, right? But the one isn't something that is distinct from other things. It's not set apart from other things. There's just fundamentally it. And so I think that what Plotinus wants to say about the one is also rather similar to what Anaximander wanted to say about the arche, which in his view was the apeiron, right? It's something that is not definite. It's indeterminate. Okay. This one, right? Even though Plotinus doesn't ordinarily call it good, he conceives of it as being like good, right? It is good to know. Okay. And so the one knows. Of course, the best kind of knowledge is of the best kind of thing. The best kind of thing, Plotinus seems to believe, is the one. And so the one, it knows itself. Okay? And so again, here's a similarity with Aristotle's prime mover, like the unmoved mover, right? What's the unmoved mover like? It understands. What does it understand? The best thing, that is itself. It is pure self-understanding. Okay. The one knowing itself generates more than it. I think that's the way I'm going to put it, even if that's not completely accurate. So if we just sort of restrict our attention to the one, which the sun stands for in the allegory of the cave, okay, we can call this like a level of reality. And indeed, for Plotinus, it's like the most fundamental. It's the ground floor level of reality. Right? His word for a level of reality is hypostasis, which is just a Greek word that could also be translated as substance, because it just means that which stands under something. So ground level is the one. Okay. Insofar as the one, though, knows itself, it generates another hypostasis. Okay. And this is the hypostasis of thought and being. So Plotinus holds that knowledge always involves distinction, differentiation, difference between knowing and known, between thought and object. So instead of one, right, there's at least two. There's a multiplicity. Okay? Indeed, he also seems to think that insofar as something is known, it has to be distinguished. It has to be differentiated from other objects. So thought implies not only an object of knowledge, but like multiple such objects. Okay? Those objects that are generated at this next level, this second hypostasis, those are pretty clearly, according to Plotinus, forms and mathematical and geometrical objects like pi or the right triangle. Okay, so that's the second hypostasis. The one was the first hypostasis. Interestingly, Plotinus apparently sometimes calls the first hypothesis father, and this would make the second hypostasis son. Father, because first hypothesis generates second hypothesis. Hypostasis. Son. So first hypostasis, second hypostasis. Okay. A brief digression here on generation needs to be made. I think that Plotinus distinguishes generation from causation. I believe that generation and causation are different in two respects. One, generation is not something that in his view happens over time. Okay? So the relationship between the one and thought and being here refers to the objects of thought, like the forms. The relationship between the one and thought being is not a relationship of before and after, right? Thought being depends upon one, but it doesn't come after one in time. Okay, so generation is, we could say, like it's atemporal, according to Plotinus. Okay, the second important difference is this: Plotinus seems to think of causation as giving. Okay, it's like a donation of one thing, so as to make for another, right? If generation were causing, then if it was causation, the one would have to give something of itself so as to make the second hypostasis of thought and being. But according to Plotinus, that is not so. The relationship between the one and thought being, so first hypostasis to second hypostasis, is, according to Plotinus, like the relationship between the sun and the light that it radiates. Okay, his view was, and this was like a common view in the ancient world, the sun is an inexhaustible source of light, right? It constantly, endlessly generates light without ever over time being diminished, right? This is not a matter of the sun giving away something so that over time it is less and less. Okay, so it is with the relationship between the Father hypostasis, the one, and the Son hypostasis, thought, being, right? Generation is atemporal, and it does not involve giving. So, right, that which generates is in no way diminished by the generation. Okay. I believe, like, a technical term that so-called Neoplatonists would use to describe this relationship was emanation. Emanation. So instead of talking about the generation of the second hypostasis from the first hypostasis, we could talk about the emanation of the second hypostasis from the first hypostasis. There is, of course, as you're probably expecting at this point, a third hypostasis. Yeah, just as thought is of form, right? Insofar as the one knows itself. So, according to Plotinus, soul, or suke, right, senses body in the effort to cognize, to become aware of form. I think I have that right. So the relationship between thought, form, and the one is supposed to be like the relationship between soul, or suke, body, and form. Okay. Knowing form, we are always aware of unity, of oneness in one way or another. All the forms are, as it were, like images of the one. So in sensing bodies, according to Plotinus, following Plato, after all, we are always aware, whether we know it or not, of the forms. Because after all, every body that we encounter, in one way or another, like, is an image, right, of the forms. Okay, and so here we have like the third hypostasis. It is generated by, it emanates from the second hypostasis. Right? So all of that is kind of Plotinus's elaboration on Plato's metaphysics as expressed by the allegory of the cave, chiefly. The next part of what he wants to say seems to be largely based upon the Timaeus. And actually, truth be told, it's probably not just based upon the Timaeus, but upon like a Stoic reading of the Timaeus. The Timaeus was actually an important work for Stoic views about the cosmos. So, soul, as Plotinus conceives of it, suke as Plotinus conceives of it, is basically one thing that is the soul, the principle of organization of the whole of the physical world, right? So there is, according to Plotinus, following the Stoics, reading the Timaeus, there is a world soul, okay, and that's the being that Stoics very often would call Zeus, if they were Greek, and I trust like Jupiter if they were Latin first language Stoics. Okay, so the cosmos, consisting of physical things, of bodies, itself has a soul, according to Plotinus. That soul apparently is, while one, also partitioned. Different parts of it are associated with different bodies, okay? And so his view then is that a human being is actually a composite being. We're physical stuff, right? Organized at any one time and over time by soul, suke. And this soul that does this organizing of this bunch of matter, that is itself part of one world soul. Okay. And most of us are confused about this. Okay. Why is this? Well, insofar as we are embodied souls, we are affective beings. The physical thing that our souls inhabit, that they're somehow connected to, that can both please us and bring us suffering, and through it, other physical things can both delight us and bring us suffering. The delight and the suffering are such that most people become then very, very concerned with bodies, with physical stuff, right? Like with having the stuff that brings delight and avoiding the stuff that brings suffering. Indeed, they become so concerned with these bodies that they become, in a sense, slaves to them, right? Like doing whatever is necessary given the disposition of bodies, right, about them, to right, avoid suffering and enjoy, right, whatever delights, whatever pleasures are to be had in connection with physical things. People who live this way, like slaves, right, to bodies, people who live this way come to devalue themselves insofar as they are beings of soul, right? Right. After all, if they live as slaves to physical things, right, they are going to think of themselves as somehow like less important as psychological beings than the beings that dominate them, these physical things, right? Additionally, if you are so very concerned with the pleasures and pains that physical things bring, you're probably also going to tend to think of yourself as like completely separate and distinct from other living beings, from other ensouled beings, like from other human beings, right? After all, the way that they are affected by bodies, by physical things, is not the way that you are affected by those things. I think like Bill Clinton was famous for a number of things, but one of the things he was famous for was a saying, and I think that the saying was, "I feel your pain," and no, right? Like you, strictly speaking, you can't feel anybody else's pain. Like their pain is their own. The same goes for their delights. Okay, so if you're very focused on the pleasures and pains that physical things can bring you, right, you're going to tend to think of yourself as like entirely separate, entirely distinct from other beings of soul. Right? Okay, what I've just described, is basically evil, according to Plotinus. Evil for him it boils down to kind of an understandable error that we make as ensouled physical beings, or maybe I should say it differently, souls that have been embodied. The mistake is twofold, right? One, thinking of ourselves as like separate and independent from other beings of soul. That's one mistake. And the other mistake is like wildly overrating physical things, like wildly overvaluing physical things. Plotinus's view is not that physical things, strictly speaking, are bad. They're not. They all emanate, at least indirectly, from the One, and the One is that's the divinity. For Plotinus, it's good, right? It's good through and through. Anything that emanates from it is also going to be good. But material things, like while not bad, while good, are in his view good to the least degree. Their goodness is, as it were, like a shadow compared to the One. Okay, and it's certainly also much less than like the good of the more fundamentally real forms and mathematical and geometrical objects too, right? So evil for him is kind of an understandable mistake of overemphasizing separateness of one soul from another and overrating the goodness of physical objects. Okay. And so, right, if we need to do well, we need to stop being evil. And the way to stop being evil is, of course, to, again, like turn away from these physical things, right? Diminish in yourself desire for them beyond that which is necessary to do what's really important. What's really important is like somehow getting in touch with, getting in tune with what's more fundamentally real, that which is in the allegory of the cave, represented by the heavenly bodies in general and the sun in particular. Okay. So what you need to do then is what you really need to emphasize in your life, like the rational part of your soul. Because it's through the rational part of your soul that you can come to think, right? This is how you can achieve episteme, right? Knowledge of the forms. And note that when you do that, you overcome your particularity. Because like when you understand, for instance, like the Pythagorean theorem, when you are able to contemplate like that truth, like you are no longer, insofar as you're doing that, different from any other being of soul that can reason, right? You and that other soul that can reason can both entertain like exactly the same thought. You can behold exactly the same truth. Okay? So, right, knowing the forms, doing some mathematics and geometry, that's a way for you to, as it were, like ascend from, right, the level of soul and body to the level of thought and being. Get in touch with that which is more fundamentally real, right? And overcome division, overcome separateness. Okay. But there's another stage. So that's one ascent. Okay. On your way to being in the ideal condition that a human being can be in. On your way to like being the best a human being can be. But there's another stage, right? So this ascent that I just described, that's to thought and being from soul and body, right? Plotinus also believed, though, that you could move from the level of thought and being to the level of the one, and that would be like the high point of this process of ascent to a condition that was the very best for a human being to be in. But here's the thing about this like last step in ascent to like the peak of human existence. It's not a cognitive step. It's not a step that you can take by way of an argument, by way of like dialectical speech. It's not a step that you can take in thought really like at all. If thought is a matter of cognizing things, of grasping them with concepts, of reasoning your way to a conclusion. Right? And that's because, again, according to Plotinus, like all thought involves difference. All thought involves like opposition. Okay, so if you're thinking something, you're thinking of it, right? You are not it. You're separate from it. Okay. If you want to be sort of in tune with, in touch with the one, you can't be separate from it. You can't be separate from it. Okay. You have to somehow like be it, right? You have to like enter into a kind of communion with it. How is this done, right? That actually is something of a mystery. It's not clear how people like Plotinus believed this could be done. Plotinus himself claimed to have done it, I think, 4 times during his lifetime. However, Neoplatonists, so-called Neoplatonists, thought they could do this. This aspect of Neoplatonist thought, I believe, so-called Neoplatonist thought, I believe helps to explain their openness to various religious movements in that part of the world at that time. There were a number of different religious movements back then. What we call Christianity was just one of them, and there were many different kinds of Christianity, but there were a number of other movements too. A good many of which are, I believe, sometimes summed up by the term like mystery cult or mystery religion, and these movements promised actually like something like unity with the divine, like unity with God, through various like ritualistic practices. They were definitely not philosophical practices. If you think of philosophical practices like something Socrates did, like a certain kind of argumentative speech with others. like, oh no. And the so-called Neoplatonists, like they were very open to this. Okay, this also makes sense if you consider that Plotinus and his followers were all operating in an intellectual environment that was post-skepticism. That is, like, skepticism had happened as a major philosophical movement. Educated people, such as Plotinus, they would have been very well aware of skeptical arguments having to do with basically the limitations where knowledge is concerned. Right? It's quite likely, I think, that they agreed with the skeptics to some extent. Right? They agreed that human knowledge is limited, our cognitive powers are limited. Right? Indeed, it looks to me like they agreed with the skeptics that when it comes to like what's fundamentally real, right? This is something that we actually cannot be in tune with just by way of like our cognitive powers. Can't do it. Okay. It seems to me quite likely that they agreed with this while still regarding it as crucial to human well-being, to somehow be in touch with, be in tune with, like what's fundamentally real. Right? So perhaps due to the influence of skepticism, they gave up on the notion that we could get there all the way cognitively, right? But they still thought, right, we should be able to get there, and we can get there. How? Well, like by these other like non-cognitive measures, right? Including, it seems, various odd ritualistic practices of people belonging to various mystery cults. Okay. So, last thing then on, or last thought on the Neoplatonists. It's my suspicion that the historians, 19th century historians who claimed that term Neoplatonism, they didn't just do this because they wished to avoid what they regarded as a misunderstanding. They also wish to like demarcate very clearly Plotinus and his followers from Plato, because they thought that the philosophy of late antiquity in particular, and of Plotinus and his followers, late antiquity generally, and Plotinus and his followers in particular, they thought of all this as like inferior. They thought of it as kind of a part of a process of decline in philosophical thought. This thought supposedly had reached its high point towards the end of the Greek classical period with Plato and Aristotle, and then declined somewhat right during the Hellenistic age, and then with people like Plotinus and his followers, like declined like still further. So there's like a value judgment. That's what I'm getting at, like built into this appellation, like Neoplatonist. And it is also, I think, the case that they blamed the decline on foreign influences. So to these people, it was not a coincidence that philosophy declined during the Hellenistic era. After all, the Hellenistic era gets kicked off with, the Greek conquest of the Persian Empire. That conquest put Greeks in contact with people to the far east of them, relatively far east of them. They thereby acquired a host of non-Greek ideas, which then entered into the Greek world and had a corrupting influence. And I think these historians imagined that trend actually continued, right, all through the period of Roman dominance of this part of the world too. So the view then is that this philosophy it's an example of decline in what came to be known later as Western culture, and it's a decline that's caused by the corrupting influence of Oriental ideas. I think that's probably what was going on with the coining and popularization of that term, like Neoplatonism. And I think, as you already can tell, I think that's pretty clearly rubbish. Hopefully, as I have explained what I understand from about Plotinus's views, hopefully you can already tell that pretty much all of that is Greek through and through, right? The ethical philosophy that Plotinus is advocating, it's already there in Plato. If you go looking for it, right? There's a way of plausibly reading him as saying that, right? That's the way to go in life. The life of a philosophically oriented ascetic. That's the way to go. As far as his metaphysics goes, Plotinus's metaphysics, right? Who isn't it reminiscent of, right? There's stuff in there that seems pretty clearly drawn from Aristotle, right? Of course, a great deal of it is drawn from Plato, particularly the myths that he tells, like the Timaeus, read through the Stoics. And much of what he wants to say about the One seems to be a repetition of things that Parmenides said, and Xenophanes before him. And this whole idea, too, that the soul is something different from the body, and in order to do well in life, we somehow need to purify ourselves, purify our souls of influence, right, that the body has over us. Right, that idea goes back to at least Pythagoras, and it's true. It's probably true that Pythagoras got a lot of his ideas from the East, but Pythagoras was a 6th century BCE Greek. Plotinus is 3rd century Common Era. Those ideas that Pythagoras got from the East then had been circulating among the Greeks for something like 1,000 years. Right? So by the 3rd century, even if those ideas weren't Greek to begin with in origin, they surely were Greek by then. 1,000 years, I think, of possession is enough to establish ownership, right? And as I just indicated too, it looks as though this idea that the final step in ascent is going to have to be non-cognitive, that idea seems to have been influenced by skepticism. Okay, so the point that I'm driving at here is that whether Plotinus's thought represents decline or not, right? It is almost certainly not the product of Plotinus's thought of outside Eastern Oriental influences, right? For good or ill, right? It looks instead to me like his thought is pretty much entirely the product of endogenous factors, like homegrown Greco-Roman factors, ideas which already belonged to that culture. Okay, so I'm going to turn next to of all of the people who were influenced significantly by Plotinus, probably the most important of them historically, and that is Augustine, someone who would go on to become a saint of the Catholic Church.